Hello pattern readers. In this video I'm going to be talking about book to screen changes in season 1 episode 7 of The Wheel of Time, The Dark Along the Ways. Now this episode happens to be my favorite of the season so far. Haven't seen the finale yet, although there's close competition. So overall I'm very happy with the changes made in this episode, but there are some controversial ones that are going to be interesting to talk about. This video may include spoilers for all Wheel of Time books. If you have not finished reading the series and do not want to be massively spoiled, stop here or proceed at your own risk. So in the ways, the one change I wanted to talk about was the change to Machin Shin. Instead of being a voice that's sort of generic, maybe saying the same thing to whoever hears it, it is individualized to each person hears their own thing. And to sort of add to that effect, they use the voices of the actors themselves in a blend for each person. So sometimes you would hear like one voice sounding a little bit more prominent than another. It was a really good touch. I really appreciated that we actually got quite a bit of insight into what each character is thinking using this device. Of course, it's a little less creepy in a way because of the lack of blood and bones and all kinds of gross stuff that Machin Shin did in the book, but in a way it's more horrifying for the characters themselves because they are hearing things that seem to tie into their deepest fears, insecurities, weaknesses, and so on. I also wanted to comment on this question of, in the show, do you have to channel to open the ways? It would seem like maybe no, based on some of the extras in the Prime Video page, where we see some stills of Padan Fain holding this trefoil leaf, suggesting that perhaps this is the key that he used to access the ways. Now, this didn't make it into the episode at all, so it's possible that they cut that out because they do want this to be a change, or not. It's really still left up in the air. But if Padan Fain is not able to access the ways with this key, if they cut that out on purpose, then someone helped him get in, and then we have the sort of same question of who could that be? And the most obvious candidate would seem to be Liandrin, just based on the idea that Liandrin is meeting with some man in North Harbor. We didn't ever find out who that was, but perhaps it could have been Padan Fain. Almost certainly it's someone connected to the shadow, and that is why she didn't want people to know about this. Moiraine may not realize that's why, but that would be the thing that she would most want to keep secret. Initially, I was surprised by this change of Lord Aguilmar showing much less deference to Moiraine as an Aes Sedai than he did in the books, where he was really quite in awe of and doing anything he could to accommodate anyone from the White Tower. Instead, he seems to want to exert some of his own power and independence in this scene. He doesn't like the idea that Moiraine might be coming to give him advice or guidance that was unasked for. A reason why I think they might have wanted to make this change is because pretty much all of the cultures we have seen so far have been steered a little bit towards the matriarchal side. Tarvalon, of course, completely so, but the other cultures that we've gotten a chance to see, we've seen the Two Rivers, and they have played up women being more in charge there by having Meryn be more of the leader than Bran. And of course, Nynaeve is a leader in the Two Rivers, as she always was in the books as well. And then we saw among the Tuatha'an that it seemed like Isla was more of the leader rather than Rhaen. And I think the reason why we might have had those changes is because we didn't have Caemlyn. So we wanted to see more of this world where there are some cultures that are shifted more towards the matriarchal side. But then again, we want to show that there's some contrast there, that not every culture is matriarchal. As we know from the books that Lord Aguilmar is the leader in Shinar. Even though he has a sister, it's clearly not a matriarchal society. Now, women probably can be rulers in the Borderlands, as we see in other Borderland countries, but preference is not given to women in the way that a man could never sit the throne in Caemlyn. So it then becomes a little bit more relevant to see like how are Aes Sedai treated in a society that is not specifically matriarchal. Now, they don't hate Aes Sedai there. He was welcoming to her, but there isn't necessarily that same level of deference. And so I think that could be a reason to highlight the difference there. It's also possible that it will come into play somehow in the final episode, although with Moiraine already being off into the Blight with Rand, I'm not sure how much headbutting she and Aguilmar can really do. Let's talk about Min's visions. They've been pared down quite a bit. She says much fewer things than she says in the book. Now, one difference might be she's talking to Moiraine instead of Rand. And it seems pretty clear from the context that she's not telling Moiraine everything that she sees, at least when it comes to what she sees around Rand. She holds some things back. What she does share, I think the one that the audience is most easily going to understand is what she sees around Perrin. She sees the golden eyes. Well, we've seen that before. We know it has some connection to the wolves if you haven't read the books. And then I like the way they sort of have disguised what she sees around Nynaeve and Egwene. She's looking at both of them at the same time. We don't actually see the images in that case, and she tells Moiraine she sees a white flame and a golden ring. We don't know which goes with which. She hasn't described them further. From the context of having read the books, I think we can say that the white flame probably goes to Egwene and refers to her becoming Amyrlin, and then the gold ring is most likely Lan's gold ring that he gives to Nynaeve. But again, it's left very open to interpretation. It might not be that. And the most intriguing is the one they've added, the one that book readers never saw. Rand with a baby. Looking at Rand with this baby, the thing that I think has sprung to a lot of people's mind is this could be a baby that he has with Min specifically. And it certainly could be something else. But I do like that they have added in an element that we as book readers are still trying to parse out what it means, and maybe they will surprise us. Likewise, when she tells Moiraine that the Amyrlin seat will be her undoing, is she talking about Swan? Will her love for Swan be a sort of weakness that leads to her undoing in some way? Or will this refer to Elaida when she becomes Amyrlin, or maybe even Egwene? It's really hard to say with the timing of things. I think it's less likely to have anything to do with Egwene given the timing, but it could relate to Elaida, and we also don't really know in what way that might lead to Moiraine's undoing. So I like that they've made that one kind of intriguing for book readers as well. And then what she tells Rand later, that she sees rainbows and carnivals and 3 beautiful women. It's written in such a way that you might think she's not being serious. As book readers, we have to know that this is going to mean something. 2 of those are likely additions in some way. There's nothing really in the book about rainbows for Rand. I've heard lots of theories on that, but the one that I think is most likely is that they might add a rainbow at a crucial moment in his storyline. So it could be his epiphany on Dragonmount, or it could be any number of significant moments that he has throughout the series. Other theories out there that I liked were the swirls of colors that he sees later on when he's connected to Perrin and Madden, whoever else might be, to Viren as well. Some people have said the colors of the 7 Ajas. I don't think that's very rainbow-like personally, so I'm not leaning in that direction. And then the carnival, again, is he somehow going to have something to do with Val and Luca in this turning, or maybe it's something else entirely? And then, of course, I think we do know who those 3 beautiful women are. So now it's time to talk about what for many people was the most controversial change in this episode, and the one thing that some people just really did not like, a so-called love triangle between Rand, Egwene, and Perrin. Now, my main thing here is that what we saw in this episode is not a love triangle. You can't, in my mind, just call any situation where you have 3 people with somewhat complicated romantic or semi-romantic feelings a love triangle. In order to really be a love triangle, I think this would have to be something that would be more fully played out. So for instance, we'd have to develop this further, and Perrin would have to continue to harbor feelings for Egwene. Maybe Egwene at some point would question whether she has feelings for Perrin. There would have to be some question of, is she going to end up with Rand? Is she going to end up with Perrin? That's what we would have to really see in order for this to be a love triangle. And I do not think we're going to see any of that. And we certainly haven't seen it so far. So what have we really seen on screen? Perrin, in the first episode, seem to be sort of hanging back to maybe see Egwene staying in the Wine Spring Inn on her big day because he hadn't gotten a chance to speak to her yet. And Nynaeve gave him a nudge to go home and see his wife, Layla. Layla, for whatever reason, had chosen not to go to Egwene's braiding ceremony. Probably Layla had some sense of that. If I had to say, based on what we've seen, it makes sense that Perrin might have had a crush on Egwene. There's a big difference between a crush and being in love with someone. They've known each other their whole lives, and they've known Rand their whole lives. And it seems like there's always been this kind of vibe and understanding of some sort between Rand and Egwene. So whatever crush Perrin had would probably be something he would never act upon because of Rand. This is just so normal, right? For close friends that grow up together, people have crushes. Young people have crushes. This happens. It's not always something that you're ever going to act upon. So that's what I think it is. It's a crush. And maybe that's something that Layla was a little bit sensitive about. But my guess would be still that there were other reasons for that. So I still go back to, I believe that Layla had a miscarriage. That might have made her feel more vulnerable and less inclined to want to be around the woman that her husband had had a crush on, unrequited. And you know what? After Perrin loses his wife and Rand and Egwene break up and Egwene and Perrin are alone together on this journey where they're not sure if they're ever going to see their friends again, we still didn't see him act on this crush whatsoever. That would have been completely inappropriate if he had, but he didn't. Absolutely nothing happened there other than we can see that they have strong feelings for each other. They care about each other, that they're friends. But Machin Shin speaks to him, telling him that he loved another woman more than his wife. It's Machin Shin. Does Machin Shin actually see into someone's soul and know their real thoughts and feelings? Or do they say the worst thoughts that someone might have that may or may not be true? I think based on what we hear from the other characters, it's the worst version of things in many cases. Egwene feeling like an imposter and a fraud, and Nynaeve believing that she's not going to be able to protect anyone and she's just going to lose everyone and watch people die. We know those things aren't true. It's just their absolute worst fears and insecurities. I think we can extrapolate and say that that's probably the case of what's happening with Perrin as well. So he has some guilt over that. Maybe some of these old crush feelings that he had have been reawakened a little bit. He's feeling intense guilt over Layla, and Machin Shin pulls that out of him. So again, it's an extreme version of the truth and reality. And then it all comes to a head because of something Nynaeve says. Now, is Nynaeve right? Are Rand and Perrin always fighting over Egwene and trying to win her as a prize? Apparently not, because Rand was completely unaware of this dynamic. So I think Nynaeve is reading an awful lot into this situation, and she says something in a moment of stress. And I think we have to look at the overall circumstances here. All of them have just heard Machin Shin. They think most of them are going to die. Maybe all of them are going to die. And so she says something that's extreme and that probably is not really true. But Perrin states very emphatically that the only woman he has loved is his wife, Layla. And I believe him. Again, I think there's a very clear distinction between having a crush and being in love with someone and even thinking about acting on it. So to me, all of this is ultimately interesting and very realistic that we would have these kinds of dynamics. Did it need to play out in this big scene? Definitely not. But the reason why it did was because of what they had been through. I think if it had not played out in this particular way, then the four of them were very likely to get into some other kind of fight and blow up just because of the circumstances they were in. If Matt had been there, it wouldn't have played out in that exact way. That he would have been able to diffuse that particular dynamic with humor, as we have seen him do in other ways. Now, again, because of the circumstances, maybe they had to come to this fight and this blow up over something, no matter what it would be. And so it might have been something else if Matt had been there. What I'm noticing is that it makes perfect sense for the characters to have blown this situation up into something more than it is under the circumstances. I think that's totally fine. But what I'm also seeing is that I think people watching are not recognizing that that's what's happening, and they themselves are kind of blowing it into something bigger, and then getting upset about the idea of there being unnecessary relationship drama or a love triangle that isn't really there. I think what it is that anytime something in a story edges a little close to those things, relationship drama and love triangles, there's a knee-jerk reaction among a lot of people that I don't like that. It's not for me, it's for teenage girls. And I would ask you to check that assumption, because relationship drama, if you want to call it that, can apply to anyone at any age. Love triangles can happen to anyone at any age. They're not automatically the stereotypical variety that we think of, like a Twilight, for example. So if you have that knee-jerk reaction of, I don't like those things, just ask yourself if that's really a fair judgment to have. Or is it this idea that we have that anything that teenage girls might like are not really worth taking seriously? Easily one of my favorite book-to-screen changes that they've made in this entire season is the improvement to romances. And that is certainly exemplified in this episode by Lan and Nynaeve. So we can't just focus on what happens in this episode because they've been building up towards it all season. But here we get Nynaeve being really let into more of Lan's history. She gets to meet these other Malkyri who are so close to Lan. He later tells her about his history, how Malkyr was lost, how his parents died, and how he would have been a king if neither of those things happened. And in this case, she's learning it from him instead of learning it from Aguilmar as she does in the book. So it's much more personal, and it allows it to sort of tie in more to that romance. But the biggest true change thus far, because everything else we've seen really are things that could have happened off screen in some fashion in the books, is that Nynaeve goes into his room and they have sex. So these are big changes, of course. I think that change stems a lot from the change to the culture of the Two Rivers, because in the books this wouldn't have happened, because the Two Rivers culture is much more puritanical, much more prudish about such things. And that's just been changed as an overall concept of the Two Rivers in the show. I think this is a very welcome change. I think the prevailing culture overall at this time versus 1990 has changed. What might have been seen as just a little bit backwards at the time, this Two Rivers culture, would now seem much more backwards in comparison. I'm sure there are some people who don't like this, but frankly, I just feel like that holding on to that much more extreme view on sex would feel like a holdover, like not something that would be really easy for audiences to relate to, and there's no particular need for it. This isn't something that has come up in the show yet, but in the books there is a canon birth control that exists, a fairly common thing that it will be created in a fantasy world as some kind of fantasy birth control. And it apparently was easy to access and fairly effective in the books. And in reality, when those things exist, that would tend to encourage less extremely restrictive attitudes towards sex and premarital sex when you have access to that. So I think it's actually more fitting with, if they choose to continue this existence of a contraceptive, that you could also then have people engaging in sex without being married. Lastly, let's talk about the change to how Rand is starting to come to the realization that he is the Dragon Reborn. So I really love the way they handled the reveal. This was one of my favorite moments of the episode. The big difference here is that Rand comes to this on his own. He isn't told by anyone that he is the Dragon Reborn. With all of the information he has, and the very last piece is what Min tells him. Right? He pretty much has a very strong suspicion from what he heard from Tam about his birth, and from the fact that he is channeling, and he now at least realizes that he can channel. he's putting those things together. But then what Min tells him is the final piece, that she saw a vision long, long ago. She knew that the man she saw, Tam, would find this baby and raise him as his own, and that that baby is the Dragon Reborn. So he then has every reason to believe it. I absolutely loved that Min was a part of that moment for him. She is such an important figure in his life going forward, and that she gets to be there for him as he is realizing the most crucial fact of his life. That is honestly just really emotional, and I love that. I love the way that whole moment happens between the two of them, but also incorporating the flashback between Tigraine and Tam, which was one of the best moments in the episode as well. So what does it mean that Rand realizes this without anyone having to tell him? I mean, I think we can understand his motivation for it, right? Given all of the information that he has in this circumstance that he didn't have at this point in the book, and the fact that his friends are at risk. If he doesn't say something, he would be putting the people he cares about most at risk when he didn't need to. He has all the motivation to say, yeah, it's me, and to accept that and to tell Moiraine. So I absolutely believe that he would do that. It is probably going to change his trajectory going forward. We can certainly skip over some of the agonizing of not wanting to accept that he can channel, absolutely not accepting that he is the Dragon Reborn for a couple of books. I think given how much things need to be condensed in order to have some hope of adapting this whole series in a reasonable number of seasons, yeah, we need to cut through some of that. But at the same time, it's not like this is going to cut away that much of his arc, because look at it in the grand scheme of things. He spends a couple books out of 14 struggling with accepting that. But then he has to struggle to accept how the world sees him and how to manage being the Dragon Reborn in the world and what that actually means, because he has no idea what that means yet. There's huge aspects of his arc that are still yet to come. Rand al'Thor has one of the most complex and just huge arcs in the entire series. So the idea that by kind of skipping over some of his doubts and stubbornness at the very beginning, that we're missing out on a lot of his arc, no. We have got so much more to cover. So I think we're just beginning here with Rand. This was the first episode where we're really starting to get an idea of what's really going on with him and who he really is. It's just beginning. As for how it ends with Rand and Moiraine going off into the Blight without the others, we'll have to wait and see how that plays out in the last episode. So I will kind of reserve my thoughts on that until we actually see the finale. Again, I love this episode. There were some really significant changes. There were some moments that I just will never forget. I think overall people were really excited about this episode, but give me your thoughts in the comments. What do you think we're going to see in that finale? Make sure you are a subscriber, and for the last time this season, gird your loins, my friends.